On the morning of April 12, 1987, Susan Hartley knelt on the floor of Conference Room 4C in the Pentagon's E-Ring, her knees pressing against the institutional gray carpet that covered every square foot of the building's endless corridors. She was 41 years old, a security specialist who had worked in the Department of Defense for 16 years. And she had come to this particular room to investigate what should have been a routine maintenance issue, a loose floor access panel that facilities staff had reported. During their weekly inspection rounds, the panel, a 2-foot square of removable flooring designed to provide access to the electrical and data cables running beneath the Pentagon's foundation, had been showing signs of repeated removal scratches around the edges, a slightly bent corner, dust patterns that suggested frequent handling. Hartley had seen hundreds of such panels during her career, and she expected to find nothing more alarming than evidence of unauthorized smoking breaks, or perhaps a forgotten lunch bag shoved into the crawl space by a careless contractor. She used a standard hex key to lift the panel, revealing the dark cavity below a shallow space, approximately 18 inches deep, crisscrossed with bundles of cables wrapped in yellow insulation, smelling of concrete dust and old electrical wiring. And there, wedged between 2 conduit pipes, wrapped in clear plastic and carefully positioned to avoid contact with any metallic surfaces, was a cassette tape. The tape itself was unremarkable, a standard microcassette of the type used in handheld recording devices, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand with no visible labels or markings. But its presence in this location was profoundly wrong. Conference Room 4C was a restricted access briefing space used for classified discussions among senior communications staff, strategic planning officers, and occasionally members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The room was swept regularly for electronic surveillance devices. Personnel entering were required to log their names, clearance levels, and purpose of visit. Recording devices of any kind were strictly prohibited, not just forbidden by policy, but physically collected at the security checkpoint before anyone entered the corridor. The existence of this tape meant that someone with authorized access had deliberately concealed a recording device, captured classified conversations, and hidden the evidence in a location where it might remain undetected indefinitely. Hartley stood slowly, her mind already running through the protocols she would need to follow. She did not touch the tape. She did not remove it from its hiding place. She backed out of the room carefully, locked the door using her master security key, and walked directly to the office of the Pentagon's counterintelligence liaison, a journey that would set in motion an odd investigation revealing one of the most damaging espionage operations ever, conducted inside the American defense establishment. Tape was recovered that afternoon under controlled conditions, photographed in place, dusted for fingerprints, and transported to the FBI's Washington field office for analysis. The audio quality was poor ambient noise, muffled voices, the hollow acoustics of a large room, but the content was unmistakable. The recording captured portions of a classified briefing that had occurred 3 weeks earlier, on March 23, 1987, during which senior Pentagon officials had discussed modernization plans for GPS-guided strike systems, assessed vulnerabilities in NATO's air defense networks, and debated the strategic implications of new Soviet submarine deployments in the North Atlantic. The classification level of the information on the tape was top-secret, sensitive, compartmented information material, so sensitive that its unauthorized disclosure could cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. Someone had recorded this briefing, hidden the evidence, and presumably planned to retrieve it at a later time. The question was, who? The Pentagon maintained meticulous access logs for all restricted spaces. Security analysts pulled the records for Conference Room 4C, covering the 3-week period between the briefing and the tape's discovery. 17 different individuals had entered the room during that window: senior officers, civilian analysts, communications specialists, and maintenance personnel. Each name was cross-referenced against personnel files, security clearance reviews, financial disclosure statements, and counterintelligence databases. The FBI established 3 primary criteria for identifying suspects. The individual must have had access to the room during the relevant time frame, must have possessed technical knowledge sufficient to install and operate covert recording equipment, and must have had a plausible reason to enter the room alone or without direct supervision. 3 names emerged as high-probability candidates. One was a Navy commander who had been present at the March 23rd briefing and had returned twice afterward to retrieve forgotten materials. The second was a civilian contractor who performed quarterly security sweeps. The third was Daniel R. Mercer, a 44-year-old senior communications technician who had worked at the Pentagon since 1977 and who had entered conference room 4C on April 8th to conduct routine maintenance on the room's audio-visual equipment. Mercer's personnel file showed a spotless record: 10 years of satisfactory performance reviews. Top secret SCI security clearance renewed without incident every 5 years. No disciplinary actions, no red flags in his background investigations. But when FBI analysts examined his access patterns over the previous decade, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Daniel Mercer had entered more than 200 restricted conference rooms over the past 10 years, always with legitimate work orders, always performing functions within the scope of his duties as a communications systems technician. His job required him to maintain audio equipment, troubleshoot wiring issues, install upgrades to secure telephone systems, and ensure that classified briefing spaces met technical security standards. He had authorized access to spaces that other civilian employees could never enter. Rooms where strategic war games were conducted, where nuclear command protocols were discussed, where senior military leadership debated contingency plans for global conflict. And because his presence was routine, expected, and necessary, he moved through these spaces with minimal supervision. The FBI began reviewing Mercer's financial records, looking for the classic indicators of espionage: unexplained wealth, sudden purchases, overseas bank accounts, cash deposits inconsistent with his government salary. What they found was more subtle, but equally incriminating. Over the past 6 years, Mercer had made periodic cash deposits into his personal checking account, always in amounts under $10,000 to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements, totaling approximately $90,000. When questioned by his supervisors during previous security reviews, Mercer had attributed this income to freelance consulting work for private sector technology firms, a plausible explanation that had satisfied investigators at the time. But when the FBI contacted the companies Mercer had listed as consulting clients, they found that none had any record of employing him. No contracts bearing his signature, no invoices, no evidence of any legitimate business relationship. The money had come from somewhere else. The investigation accelerated. FBI counterintelligence specialists established covert surveillance on Mercer's movements outside the Pentagon, tracking his daily routine, documenting his contacts, analyzing his patterns. They discovered that twice each month, with remarkable consistency, Mercer would leave work at his normal time, drive his 11-year-old Toyota sedan to a commuter parking garage in Arlington, walk approximately half a mile to Rock Creek Park, and spend 15 to 20 minutes walking along a specific trail that ran parallel to the creek. The walks appeared to be recreational. He carried no visible materials, made no obvious contacts, behaved in no way that suggested covert activity. But when FBI surveillance teams positioned themselves along the trail with long-range observation equipment, they noticed something that transformed the walks from innocent exercise into probable dead drop activity. At 3 points along the trail, park benches were positioned near large oak trees. Attached to the information kiosks at the trail entrance were laminated maps showing park features, hiking routes, and points of interest. On the days when Mercer walked the trail, one of these maps would display a colored pushpin in a position that appeared random, but followed a pattern red pins on certain dates, blue pins on others, positioned at specific coordinates on the map that corresponded to the locations. Of the 3 benches, FBI technicians examined the benches after Mercer's walks and discovered magnetic canisters attached to the underside of the seats hollow, containers designed to hold rolled documents or small objects, positioned in locations that required deliberate searching to detect. The canisters were never present before Mercer's walks and were always removed within 24 hours afterward. Someone was servicing these dead drops on a schedule coordinated with Mercer's signal system. The FBI now had direct evidence of espionage. TRADECRAFT. The challenge facing counterintelligence investigators in the spring of 1987 was determining the full scope of Mercer's activities without alerting him to the investigation or causing him to flee, destroy evidence, or warn his handlers. They needed to identify his Soviet contacts, understand what information he had already compromised, and build a prosecutable case that would withstand the scrutiny of a federal espionage trial. The solution they developed was both elegant and risky, a false flag operation designed to make Mercer believe his espionage network had been compromised and that he needed to establish contact with a backup handler. FBI Special Agent Raymond Talbot, a veteran of Cold War counterintelligence operations with extensive experience running double-agent scenarios, was selected to play the role of a GRU officer from a fictional Directorate S unit, a fabricated element of Soviet military intelligence that supposedly handled emergency communications with agents whose primary handlers had been recalled or compromised. The operation required meticulous planning. FBI analysts studied Jew communication protocols, recruitment methods, and operational procedures, drawing on information provided by previous Soviet defectors and intelligence gleaned from past espionage cases. They created a complete operational legend for Agent Talbot's fictional identity, complete with knowledge of Soviet internal politics, familiarity with GRU jargon, and a plausible cover story explaining why emergency contact protocols were being activated. On April 29, 1987, Daniel Mercer received a telephone call at his home. The call came at 9:47 p.m., late enough to ensure privacy, but not so late as to immediately raise alarm. The voice on the other end spoke in lightly accented English, identifying himself only as Victor from the embassy, and stating that he needed to arrange an urgent meeting regarding administrative changes affecting mutual friends. The phrasing was carefully constructed to sound like coded intelligence communication, while remaining sufficiently vague that, if the call was being recorded by someone other than the FBI, it could be dismissed as a wrong number or mistaken identity. Mercer agreed to the meeting. The fact that he agreed, that he did not hang up, did not question the caller's identity, did not express confusion or refuse the contact, was itself incriminating evidence that he recognized the communication as related to espionage activity. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening at a Falls Church apartment that the FBI had prepared as a covert surveillance site, equipped with concealed cameras and audio recording devices that captured every word and gesture. Agent Talbot arrived at the apartment dressed in the conservative dark suit typical of Soviet diplomatic personnel, carrying a warm leather briefcase that suggested years of operational use. Mercer arrived 6 minutes late, visibly nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he removed his jacket and sat in the chair that Talbot indicated. The conversation that followed was recorded in its entirety and would later form the centerpiece of the federal prosecution. Talbot began by explaining, in carefully rehearsed detail, that Mercer's primary handler, a GRU case officer named Viktor Lebedev, who operated under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy, had been urgently recalled to Moscow due to administrative complications that Talbot did not specify. The recall meant that existing communication protocols were suspended and that Mercer needed to follow new procedures for delivering material and receiving payment. Mercer listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from anxiety to cautious relief. Then he asked the question that sealed his fate. "Are the tapes safe?" It was a simple question, 4 words spoken in a moment of stress and uncertainty, but it confirmed everything the FBI suspected. Mercer was not asking about audio equipment maintenance or legitimate work materials. He was asking about recorded classified information tapes that he had created, concealed, and passed to Soviet intelligence. Talbot, maintaining his role, assured Mercer that previous deliveries had been received and processed, that payment arrangements would continue under the new protocol, and that Mercer should prepare a comprehensive inventory of materials he could provide going forward. Over the course of 90 minutes, Mercer described his 10-year espionage operation in detail. He explained how the operation had begun in 1979 at a technology conference in Washington, D.C., the Capital Systems Expo, an annual gathering where government communications specialists, defense contractors, and private sector engineers gathered to discuss developments in secure communication systems. Viktor Lebedev had approached him during a coffee break, introducing himself as a technical attaché from the Soviet embassy, with interest in commercial applications of communications technology. The initial conversations were innocuous, focused on technical specifications and engineering challenges, the kind of professional discussion that occurred regularly at such conferences. But over subsequent meetings, Lebedev had gradually steered the relationship toward more sensitive topics, expressing curiosity about Pentagon communications infrastructure, asking questions about security protocols, demonstrating detailed knowledge of American defense systems that suggested intelligence training rather than diplomatic service. At some point during 1979 or early 1980, Mercer could not recall the exact date, and investigators would later determine that this vagueness was likely intentional, a psychological mechanism for avoiding direct confrontation with the moment of betrayal. Lebedev had made the recruitment pitch explicit. He offered Mercer money in exchange for information. He appealed to Mercer's frustration with government bureaucracy, his resentment over perceived lack of recognition for his technical skills, his financial anxieties about supporting a family on a civil service salary. He framed the request as low-level information sharing, nothing that would truly damage American security, merely providing context that would help Soviet technical personnel understand publicly available systems. Mercer had accepted. The reasons he gave during the FBI interview were the familiar rationalizations of espionage, recruits throughout history, financial pressure, wounded pride, rationalization that the information was not truly sensitive, the gradual normalization of betrayal through repeated small compromises. The operation had evolved systematically over the following years. Initially, Mercer had simply memorized details from classified briefings and technical specifications from secure documents, writing down what he remembered after leaving the Pentagon and passing handwritten notes through dead drops in Rock Creek Park. But as his access expanded and Soviet handlers recognized the intelligence value of his position, the operation became more sophisticated. Mercer described how he had modified standard microcassette recorders, removing the indicator lights and sound dampening the mechanisms, concealing them inside ceiling-mounted speaker housings in conference rooms where he performed legitimate maintenance work. He had installed pressure-sensitive switches under conference tables that would trigger recording when chairs were moved, a technique that allowed the devices to activate automatically during meetings without requiring Mercer to be present. The recordings captured everything: strategic planning discussions, inter-service debates about weapons modernization, war game assessments of Soviet military capabilities, classified briefings on nuclear command and control procedures. Mercer would retrieve the tapes during subsequent maintenance visits, hiding them inside fake wiring conduit covers that appeared to be standard electrical fixtures, but were actually hollow containers designed specifically for concealing material. He described the payment system: cash delivered inside hollowed-out equipment manuals and replacement toolkits sent to his home by courier, carefully structured to avoid large deposits that would trigger banking regulations. He provided details about signal protocols, describing how colored pushpins on park maps indicated which dead drop location was active and what priority level the material warranted. He revealed that over 10 years, he had been paid approximately $540,000. The money distributed gradually in amounts, carefully calibrated to appear plausible as consulting income. I allowed the conversation to continue until Mercer had provided sufficient detail to construct a comprehensive damage assessment and identify all elements of the espionage network. Then, in the early hours of April 30th, agents terminated the interview and placed Mercer under arrest. The formal arrest occurred 2 days later, on May 2, 1987, at the same Arlington parking garage where Mercer had routinely begun his walks to Rock Creek Park. He was carrying a microcassette recorder concealed in his jacket pocket, a sealed packet containing 3 newly recorded tapes, and $12,000 in cash that the FBI had provided during the false flag operation as simulated payment. The bills were marked, their serial numbers documented, irrefutable physical evidence of espionage-related financial transactions. Federal agents transported Mercer to the Washington field office for processing while a second team executed a search warrant at his home in Arlington, a modest 3-bedroom house in a middle-class neighborhood where he lived with his wife of 19 years and their 2 teenage children, neither of whom had any knowledge of his espionage activities. The search of Mercer's residence revealed the full extent of his decade-long betrayal. Hidden in a locked footlocker in the basement, concealed behind boxes of holiday decorations and old sporting equipment, investigators found 81 cassette tapes containing classified audio recordings. The tapes were meticulously organized, labeled with dates and brief coded notations, indicating the content's strategic planning sessions, technical briefings, war game simulations, discussions of NATO defense postures. Also in the footlocker were cipher pads of the type used for encoding messages according to Soviet intelligence protocols, bundles of cash totaling an additional $43,000, and a handwritten ledger tracking payments received over 10 years. Most damning was a separate notebook containing Mercer's personal assessments of Pentagon personnel notes identifying which officials had access to particularly valuable information, which individuals expressed views that might make them vulnerable to recruitment, which security protocols showed weaknesses that could be exploited. The notebook revealed that Mercer had been functioning not merely as a passive collector of information, but as an active intelligence operative, identifying targets and vulnerabilities, thinking strategically about how to expand the operation and increase its intelligence yield. The damage assessment conducted by Pentagon counterintelligence specialists concluded that Mercer had compromised some of the most sensitive national security information of the 1980s, Cold War period details about American nuclear command structures, GPS-guided weapons development, NATO readiness assessments, strategic war planning, and internal debates about U.S.-Soviet force balance. The recordings had provided Soviet military intelligence with insights they could not have obtained through any other means. The actual voices of senior American defense officials, their tone, their arguments, their uncertainties, their strategic priorities laid bare in unguarded conversation. The legal proceedings moved forward with the methodical inevitability of a federal espionage prosecution built on overwhelming evidence. Mercer was charged under Title 18, Section 794 of the United States Code Conspiracy to communicate national defense information to a foreign government, a capital offense that carried the possibility of life imprisonment or death. His defense attorneys, appointed by the Federal Public Defender's Office, recognized immediately that no viable defense existed. The physical evidence was irrefutable. The tapes, the cipher pads, the marked currency, the documented dead drops, the recorded confession to an FBI agent. Mercer's only option was to plead guilty and cooperate with the damage assessment in hopes of avoiding the death penalty. He accepted a plea agreement in August 1987, providing detailed debriefings about his activities, identifying every piece of information he had compromised, describing in full his interactions with Soviet handlers. In exchange for this cooperation, federal prosecutors agreed not to pursue capital punishment. On December 3, 1987, in a sealed federal courtroom in the Eastern District of Virginia, Daniel R. Mercer was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. The judge who delivered the sentence described Mercer's actions as a profound betrayal of the trust placed in him by the American government and the American people, noting that his espionage had provided a hostile, foreign power with information that could have proven decisive in a military conflict. Mercer was stripped of his security clearances, forfeited his federal pension rights, and was ordered to forfeit all assets derived from his espionage activities. He was transported to a maximum security federal facility where he would serve his sentence in administrative segregation, separated from the general prison population for his own protection. The aftermath of the Mercer case reverberated through the Pentagon security infrastructure for years. An internal investigation revealed that Mercer had been flagged twice during routine security reviews for unexplained improvement in lifestyle, periods when his spending patterns suggested income beyond his government salary. Both times, supervisors had accepted his explanation of consulting work without conducting thorough verification. The investigation identified systematic weaknesses in how civilian contractor access was monitored, how financial irregularities were investigated, and how technical personnel with authorized access to sensitive spaces were supervised. The Pentagon implemented comprehensive reforms. Audio security protocols were completely redesigned, with sound-dampening materials installed in all classified briefing spaces. Mandatory sweep protocols established for detecting covert recording devices, and access logs automated to create tamper-proof records of who entered restricted areas and when. The reforms required an expenditure of more than $40 million and took nearly 3 years to fully implement. But the deeper damage could not be remedied through security upgrades. The intelligence that Mercer had provided to the GRU had given Soviet military planners unprecedented insight into American strategic thinking during a critical period of Cold War tension. They had heard American officials debate NATO's vulnerabilities, discuss contingency plans for nuclear escalation, assess weaknesses in European air defense networks. This information had allowed Soviet strategists to refine their own war plans, adjust their force deployments, and develop countermeasures specifically tailored to American capabilities and intentions. Counterintelligence analysts conducting the post-arrest damage assessment concluded that Mercer's espionage had advanced Soviet understanding of U.S. nuclear readiness models by several years, potentially altering the strategic balance. During a period when both sides maintained hair-trigger alert status and miscalculation could have led to catastrophic Escalation. Daniel Mercer served 18 years of his 28-year sentence before being released on supervised parole in 2005. The terms of his release were restrictive and permanent. He was prohibited from working in any capacity involving technology, communication systems, or government access. He was required to report monthly to federal parole officers. He was relocated under a new identity to a location that was never publicly disclosed, and he was forbidden from giving interviews, writing memoirs, or discussing his case in any public forum. His wife divorced him while he was incarcerated, taking their children and severing all contact. His two children, who had been teenagers at the time of his arrest, grew up knowing their father as a convicted spy, carrying the weight of that association into their adult lives. Neither maintained any relationship with him after his release. Viktor Lebedev, the GRU case officer who had recruited Mercer and run him for nearly a decade, was never prosecuted. He had left the United States in 1986, returning to Moscow under diplomatic immunity before Mercer's arrest, and he never faced any legal consequences for his role in the operation. Soviet intelligence sources later indicated that he had received commendations for his successful handling of a valuable asset, though the specific details of those commendations remain classified. In Russian archives, the hidden tape that Susan Hartley discovered under the floor panel in conference room 4C on that April morning in 1987 now resides in the National Counterintelligence Center's historical collection, a small physical artifact representing one of the most damaging espionage operations ever conducted inside the Pentagon. The tape itself is unremarkable, a standard microcassette, slightly worn, with no external markings to indicate the secrets it contains. But its significance extends far beyond the classified conversations it captured. It represents the vulnerability at the heart of every security system. The insider threat, the trusted individual who exploits legitimate access to betray the institution that granted that trust. Daniel Mercer was not a dramatic figure. He was not a glamorous spy engaging in dangerous tradecraft or conducting daring operations. He was a technician, a man with authorized access and technical knowledge, who recognized that his routine maintenance work gave him opportunities that no external intelligence operative could ever obtain. For 10 years, he walked the corridors of American military power, entering rooms where strategies were debated and secrets were shared, systematically recording information and passing it to a foreign intelligence service. And he did so not because of ideological conviction or coercion, but for money and wounded pride, the most ordinary and human of motivations, leading to extraordinary betrayal. The story of Daniel Mercer is ultimately a story about trust and its violation, about the systems we construct to protect secrets and the humans who operate within those systems. Security protocols can be strengthened, technology can be upgraded, surveillance can be enhanced. But no system can fully eliminate the risk posed by an insider who chooses betrayal, because every security system depends ultimately on human judgment, human loyalty, human character. The Cold War produced thousands of such stories, ordinary people making extraordinary choices, living double lives, serving masters their colleagues never suspected. Some were caught, like Mercer, their operations unraveling through small mistakes or patient counterintelligence work. Others were never discovered, their espionage remaining hidden, their betrayals known only to themselves and the handlers who directed them. And in the end, the true cost of these operations cannot be measured merely in the classified documents stolen or the secrets betrayed. The cost is measured in the erosion of trust, in the knowledge that the person working beside you might not be who they claim to be, in the permanent uncertainty that shadows every interaction in the world of classified work. Daniel Mercer spent 10 years recording the secrets discussed in rooms he was trusted to enter. And when those recordings were finally discovered, They revealed not just the information he had stolen, but the deeper truth about human vulnerability and the fragility of the systems we build to protect ourselves from those who would betray us.